Okay, so just a quick heads up, if you already seen part 1, 2 and 3 of this build video, there's definitely no need to sit through this 50+ minutes video again. It's just those same 3 videos put together into one big, long build video for that full build experience. The ending of this video is the same as part 3 of the build series, so I promise you, you won't miss anything. I don't want to waste anyone's time here. If you, on the other hand, haven't seen those videos and think this video seems way too long, check the playlist of those 3 videos if you want to see it in a more bite-sized manner. Otherwise, let's begin by taking a look at the frame, the parts, the weights, and let's start building. As this is a crash replacement frame and fork, I already knew exactly how much I needed to cut off the fork steerer, so that was the first step in getting this build started. On a totally new frame, I would probably have done this final cut after I made sure I was at the right height. And you know how it goes. Measure twice, cut once. I've done a couple of videos on this topic as well, so check the link up in the corner or down in the description. Next, I decided to try and sort the internal Di2 routing through the handlebars. This is the first time I've used handlebars with internal routing, so I figured it would be easier to get as much done off the bike as possible. I also removed the clamps from the shift levers, so later on I could just mount the levers directly to the bars without trying to thread them on, with all the hoses and cabling hanging in the way. The left clamp from my new shift lever was really tight and actually left some marks, but shit happens. So the first Di2 cable I routed was from my right shifter down to the internal junction, down at the bottom bracket. This cable is 120 centimeters long, and I will take advantage of this plastic pipe that comes pre-installed in the bars once you get them from the factory. And I will use my homemade routing tool made of a steel wire and a brake ferrule. And thanks to these plastic pipes, it's a really simple job. Just thread the steel wire through the pipe, connect the Di2 cable to the brake housing ferrule, and then pull everything out through the handlebars. At this stage, with only one cable going through the handlebars, it wasn't too bad. I didn't have that much of a trouble. A bit of a snag here and there, but could get it through pretty easily. I did realize though that having a total of 2 Di2 cables plus that brake hose eventually was going to be pretty fiddly. I can definitely say that internal routed handlebars, they look really sweet, and I think it's worth it once it's done, but damn, it's annoying to work on. I'm definitely not looking forward to switching bars or hoses or something else that requires this to be disassembled. On the plus side though, with the hoses and cables more out of the way, it's much easier to strap on handlebar bags, lights, computer mounts and other stuff. So there's definitely merits apart from the looks. The next cable is going between the shift levers inside the handlebar, and here we don't have a plastic hose that goes through the clamping area. So instead I took my routing tool, and with the help of some Allen keys and a wheel magnet, I managed to get it through the whole handlebar without that plastic pipe. I did struggle a bit though, I can't deny that. It did snag at a couple of places, so I had to pull it back a bit and then push it through again and use my small Allen keys to help catch that wire at a few different places. That wheel magnet also made it a lot easier. I guess a stronger magnet would be even better, but the wheel magnet was all I had at my disposal, but I got it through in the end, luckily. If you have any other tricks and tips to get this done easily without spending a lot of money on proper routing tools, be sure to let me know in the comments. With the tool finally through the handlebar, just like before, I connected the Di2 cable to the routing tool and then just worked it through the handlebars by pulling and pushing on that wire. The cable is 55 centimeters long on this handlebar that it's 40 centimeter wide. If you have wider handlebar, you might have to increase the length of the Di2 cable as well. I think it will be too short on a 44 centimeter handlebar, for example. The third and last Di2 cable that's going into this handlebar is the one that's going from my left shifter down through the drop into my handlebar end junction. By far the trickiest cable to route in my opinion. So what I did, I used one of those plastic pipes that come with the handlebar, pushed it in through the drop and used a small Allen key to fish it out at the opening behind the shift lever. I tried to do it directly with the routing tool, but that didn't go well at all. So in the end, this was the only method that worked. Once the pipe was through, I thought it would be smooth sailing. Getting the routing tool through the pipe was no problem. I connected the Di2 cable to the routing tool and quickly realized that the connector length combined with the routing tool brake ferrule was too long to insert the correct way to the handlebar. So basically I had to push it down towards the back of the handlebar. There's not enough space to flip it inside the handlebar. So in the end I actually pulled the whole cable, flipped 180 degrees as you can see once I pull it out here through the bar end. But the important thing, I got it through and the cable is still intact, so yeah. Not totally pain-free, but I managed to get this sorted in the end. So that's all the Di2 cables through the handlebars. And to prepare for the hoses that I realized would be a real pain in the ass, I decided to route 2 steel wires from each shift lever or lever. It just hit me, do you say shift lever, not lever? Oh well. To have 2 steel wires from each lever or lever to help me route those brake hoses. As you will see, they didn't make that much of a difference in the end, but I thought it was a good idea at the time. So before I put the handlebars on the bike, I will use my old rear brake hose from the crash bike as my front brake hose here, just to save a bit of money. Always good if you can reuse some of the parts you already have. I cut the hose using my box cutter against a wooden piece of plank. I found that just using a box cutter is an easy way to get a nice and straight cut. Just tap that insert into the hose, and once that's done, I will route the naked side of the hose through the handlebars, so I will end up with the insert at the shift lever or lever. Then I will cut the hose to length down at the fork, as I think it will be easier than to cut it at the shifter. As you can see, more than the actual steel wire, my small screwdriver was the main reason I got this hose through. But the steel wire was not totally useless, so I was still happy I had it there. The hose combined with the 2 Di2 wires already in place made it a really tight fit. So I definitely had to work it a bit back and forth to get it through. But once this is on the bike, I keep telling myself that it's worth it. Just to make it a bit easy to work with, I put the fork in the frame, install the stem and also put on the handlebar. And this is just dry without any grease or anything, just to make it a bit easier to work with. Like I said, I will take it apart a bit later in the build and make sure everything is nice and greased up. Same with the handlebar and stem, I will just tighten this down just to make sure it stays in place while I'm working on those brake hoses. Then I whipped out my steel wire again. Have been very heavily used in this build. I used that wheel magnet again and tried to guide it through the fork, and once I got that through, I could take my brake hose, thread it onto the steel wire and pretty easily get it through the fork down to the brake caliper. And if you've seen my old Open Up build videos, you might notice that this is the opposite way of how I did it in that video, and that's because of those internal routed handlebars. Then I moved on to preparing the rear brake hose, tapping in that insert, and just like the front brake hose, I will route this the opposite way to how I usually do it, as I want as much possible slack at the handlebar when I try to get this through, using those steel wires again that I prepared. But just like with the front hose, this is a really tight fit with those Di2 cables in place as well. As you can see, I just taped them down with some masking tape to make sure they don't slip away. In the end, I used that small screwdriver to fish it out through the opening at the clamp area. See, that was easy peasy. I'm joking though. It was a proper pain in the ass, but since the hoses now are through the handlebars, I would say that the most annoying part of this build is done. A long way from finished though. So because I'm routing from the handlebar down through the frame, I need to put on everything that goes on before that. In this case, I'm using some shrink tubing, and also need to put on the cable stops or the hose stops, as well as the foam that goes over the brake hose to keep it from rattling, that comes with the open up frame. This is just the right size to push it through the opening in the frame, so it's definitely simpler to do it when you route everything from the chainstay side. But since I'm using these handlebars, I think this was the better direction to route everything in the end. Once I got the hose down to the bottom bracket, I used, you guessed it, a steel wire to route the last part through the chainstay. I will say that if you have a spare spoke or something like that, like Open actually recommends, that will be a much easier and quicker way, because this steel wire is just too flexible to work with really. But managed to get it through in the end, so all good in the hood. You can always improve though. So then I just had to make sure everything was going into the frame as it's supposed to. Make sure that foam is all the way into the down tube. Then just a quick turn of the handlebars to make sure I have enough slack in the hose to turn the bars all the way around without it pulling on the hose. As I mounted the shift lever clamps when we started this build, it's now a lot easier to just mount the levers back on the bars. Since the cables are internally routed, you can't really move the lever around that much once they are connected to the hoses, so it all made even more sense once I got to this stage that I actually put the clamps on first. I didn't think about it then, but sometimes you're lucky. Anyway, I mounted the rear brake hose into the lever, you know the drill maybe, hose nut, then the olive, and then into the lever body. And just as I was so proud of myself for having mounted that shift clamp early on, I realized now that having the shifter mounted to the bars before I actually tightened down the hose was not the best idea. So I made sure not to make the same mistake on the front brake and connected the hose while the shifter was still off the handlebars. That made it a lot easier to tighten it down, and since I have that clamp already on the bars, I just needed to connect that later on. So that was definitely a better order of doing things. Also, when you tighten down the hose itself can kind of twist. So when you mount it to the lever, you can try and make sure it's as straight or natural bend to the hose as possible. So with the hoses connected and the shifters on the bars, I put the levers in the ballpark or where I think I would like to have them in the end. Also made sure I had my stem at the highest point. I can always slam it down, but if I measure my hoses in the slam position, I might not be able to raise my handlebars that I like to do when I go out on a bit longer adventures and bikepacking trips. So now on to the fun part, that is getting the hoses cut to length. So I will just attach the brake caliper to the fork and then basically just estimate how much hose I need to get all the way down into the caliper. There will be some slack between the fork and the handlebar as well, so it's not super critical, but like always, measure twice and cut once. Luckily, I don't have my vise connected to a workbench, which is good, as I can move it closer to the fork to tap this insert in. I will say though, if I had the Shimano hose cutting tool and insert pusher, or whatever you call it, that would have made this part a lot easier. So I will put a link to this tool in the description if you're interested. I might have to buy one next time I do something along these lines. With the hose insert in place, it was just a matter of getting the hose down into the caliper. Hose nut first, then olive, and then into the caliper. And just like with the levers, having the caliper not attached to the fork made it a lot easier to tighten that hose nut down. Then just put everything back on the fork, and the front is finally done. The rear caliper is basically the same story. I attached the caliper first and then tried to estimate how much hose I needed to cut off. I don't actually remember how much right now, but you can check how deep the hose goes into the caliper before you have everything routed, and just keep that measurement in mind and add a few millimeters just to be on the safe side. So I used my box cutter to cut this hose just as with the other hoses, and since this is a very ghetto solution, I used paper towels to protect my frame and managed to get the hose into the vise. That cutting tool I mentioned from Shimano would have been a very welcome addition to my tool collection for sure. The more I see this clip, the more I want to buy one. But I got it done in the end. Then the same story again, that hose nut, the olive, and then I could tighten the hose down into the caliper. And after that, put the caliper on the chainstay, and we are finally done with this hose mess. That sounded weird, but yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite done with the routing. I still had the Di2 cables to take care of. Luckily, compared to the handlebars, routing through the frame is not that hard. So I will just attach the cable clips to the Di2 cable coming from the handlebar. That is just to keep it from rattling inside the frame. Then I use my trusty Di2 routing tool, thread a wire through the opening in the head tube and push it down to the bottom bracket shell. And once set through, connect the Di2 cable to the routing tool and just push and pull it through the down tube. Luckily, no problem here. Once that Di2 wire was in place, I could tighten down that frame stop at the head tube with this little screw that is super easy to strip. I actually used a screw from my crashed bike first and I stripped that one. Luckily, I had other screws coming with the new frame, so saved by the crash, you could say. Then it was time to route the Di2 cable going from the junction to the seat post battery. I used the routing tool just as I've done at the other areas. Attach the cable clips to the wire. In my case, this cable is 70 centimeters long. Depending on frame size and frame geometry, cable length could differ for sure, but I would rather have too long cable than too short. The last cable of this build is the Di2 cable from the rear mech to the frame junction. This cable is 60 centimeters long in my case, but if I had to buy a new cable today, I would probably buy a 5 centimeter longer one. The hole for the cable in the chainstay is too small to use the routing tool actually, so I had to try and get this cable through without the help of that. I had a lot of trouble with the cable snagging at the chainstay where it thinnens out to clear the tire, and it kept on getting snagged there. So in the end I actually used a steel wire again and threaded it in through the chainstay and out the bottom bracket, and then kind of wrapped that wire around the Di2 cable, and I managed to get it through in the end that way. It was a lot more work than the first time I did this on my old frame, but I got it through in the end though, so lessons learned for next time. Now with all the cables in place, I wanted to make sure that everything was working correctly with the shifting and that all the wires were still intact. So I connected the rear mech and then attached all the wires to the internal junction that I will keep in the bottom bracket area. The cable coming from the handlebar I wrapped around the junction and secured it with a zip tie, as well as wrapping the junction in a small piece of handlebar tape just to keep that rattling noise from happening. Then I connected the other two cables to the junction. Since I'm running one connector will be empty, so I used one of those Di2 plugs that comes with the shift levers in place of a cable. Then I connected the cables into the shift lever as well, and having that Di2 connector tool really helps at this particular area. It's really hard to reach. The last cable in the handlebar is going into the handlebar end junction. Since I'm only using one cable into the junction, I plug the other connector with one of those plugs again. The last part to connect this system is the seat post battery. And once you connect that, you will see those small little lights light up and you should have a working system. And it's important to definitely check this before you start messing around with pressing in bottom brackets and stuff. You definitely don't want to discover that a cable has come loose in the junction or something inside the frame once that bottom bracket's already in place. So just to finish this up, I will just secure the battery into the seat post with this rubber battery holder. I think it's from Ritchie. We'll leave a link in the description as well. Just press this into the seat post and it will stay in there by friction. Put the seat post clamp onto the frame and then thread in the seat post. And I think this bike finally starts to look like something along the lines of a bike. So the next thing I will tackle here is bleeding the brakes. The reason being, I would like to make sure everything is tight and no leakage before I start messing around with pressing in bottom brackets and such. So we'll start by inserting the bleed block in the caliper and removing the bleed screw from the shift lever or the brake lever. Now we'll put on the bleed funnel adapter and then the bleed funnel. I will also just adjust the bars to have the bleed funnel nice and leveled. A good tip is to have some rubber gloves and some paper towels prepared, because there's always a risk of stuff being a bit messy when you start messing around with mineral oil. So with a completely dry system, I have found that it's always best to try and push in the brake fluid, or in this case mineral oil, from the bottom up to the shift lever. So I will pull some brake fluid into the syringe, and then before I connect this to the caliper, I will make sure to push out all the air from the syringe, just to make sure you don't introduce any unnecessary air you then need to remove from the system. So then I will connect the syringe into the bleed port on the caliper, open the bleed port with a 7mm spanner, and then slowly push in the fluid until I can see it coming up through the bleed funnel. And just to be safe, I will make sure I have at least around half of this funnel full before I disconnect the syringe. Any brake fluid or mineral oil I have left in the syringe, I can put back in the bottle and reuse later. I would not, however, reuse anything that has been pushed through the system. So everything up at the funnel I will just throw away, as it can contain contaminants and other stuff you don't want to mix with fresh new brake fluid. So then I will just squeeze the shift lever and try to get out all the air, and you probably see a bunch of air bubbles coming out. Tapping the hoses and tipping the frame back and forth also works pretty good to free those air bubbles that could be trapped inside the system. I also use the normal way of bleeding the brakes, which is to take that rubber hose, secure a plastic bag to the hose or something else to collect any eventual brake fluid. And then I connected the hose to the caliper and made sure I had enough fluid in the bleed funnel at the top. I placed my 7mm spanner on the bleed nut so that I could easily open and close the bleed nut with one hand. Then with the other hand I squeezed the brake lever, and at the same time I opened the bleed nut on the caliper. As soon as the brake lever bottomed out against the handlebar, I closed the bleed nut and released the lever. Then I start to pump the lever again, and I can feel the pressure building up, and hopefully those last stubborn air bubbles would escape. In this particular case, it didn't do much actually. Most of the air already seemed to have escaped, but in the past I had to do this several times before the lever firmed up enough and all the air stopped coming out. This method is what I use when bleeding the brakes mid-season, when you already have fluid in the system. So you don't need to use the syringe, just do a normal bleed, so to speak. As I was happy with my bleed, I made sure the bleed nuts were closed, put the stopper in the bleed funnel, then remove the funnel from the funnel adapter. And like I said, I will not reuse this fluid and just throw it away. Then I removed the bleed funnel adapter and I put the bleed screw back into the lever before I wipe the fluid off to make sure air doesn't get into the lever. Be careful here not to tighten the screw too tight, as it's super easy to strip. And if you search on weight weanings, for example, there's a lot of people, including me, that have made the mistake of tightening this screw too much. So be careful about that. Then I will just use some paper towels and some degreaser to wipe the lever clean of any excess brake fluid. Same down at the caliper. Make sure you don't have any brake fluid around there to contaminate your brake pads. And that's the front brake done. So to finish off the bleeding part here, I will just leave the time lapse of me doing the rear brake to show the complete process. Apologies for the flickering lights. I will say though a few tips. Once the air bubbles has stopped coming out to the bleed funnel when you're squeezing the lever, etc., I usually take a 10 to 15 minute break, let it set in, then do a last round of pumping the lever, tilting the frame, just to make 100% sure I got as much of the air as possible out of the system. This time it's worked out well, but in the past, if I had trouble getting all the air out of the system, especially the rear brake with its longer hose, I experienced the lever actually became squishy after a few rides, especially when you compare it to the front lever. What I did then is just use the funnel bleeding method, just attach the funnel, put in some brake fluid and squeeze the brake lever a couple of times to get all those last couple of bubbles out. The lever firmed up pretty quickly and I was back to the same firm feeling as my front brake. If you experience that, that's a quick and easy fix. You don't need to mess around with syringes or anything, so don't be afraid to do an extra bleed here and there if you feel your levers becoming a bit smushky. There we go. Both levers nice and firm. So next I will take care of the bottom bracket, but before I start pressing in cups in the frame, I wanted to make sure I didn't have any rattling inside the frame. So I just put the wheels on and bounced the frame. I tried to listen for any weird sound that could potentially annoy me out on the roads. As this is a press fit frame, it's not an easy job to take the BB out just to fix a rattling Di2 cable, for example. Once I was sure I didn't hear any weird rattling noises, I prepped the BB shell with some degreaser and a paper towel to make sure all the surfaces were nice and clean. I used this universal bottom bracket press to press the BB cups in. I just needed to make sure I had the right side of the bearing drifts. In this case it's the 30mm side, as this is a BB 386 bottom bracket. Then I prepped both the BB shell and the bearing cup with this brake protector from Wackos. This stuff is legendary here in Japan as the ultimate BB creak killer, and like I mentioned in a couple of videos where I used this before, it's very hard to find outside of Japan, unfortunately. I did however find one online store that ships worldwide and is in English, so depending on when you watch this, check the description, and if there's a link for this Wackos brake protector, you should be able to find it there. It's not cheap, but like I mentioned in previous videos, I haven't had a single creaking bottom bracket when using this stuff, so I will definitely vouch for it. I hope it's still available from that online store when you watch this video. So like I said, I will put a thin layer of this both in the bottom bracket shell and around the bottom bracket cups. If you use this stuff, be really careful not to get this on the actual bearing. I can imagine it would be borderline impossible to clean that up later, so be careful with that. Then I took both cups and aligned them in the bottom bracket shell, tried to get them square on, put on the press tool with the bearing drifts on both sides. For this tool I used an adjustable wrench on one side and an 8mm hex key to press both cups at the same time. Unfortunately this video recording cut out mid-press. I don't really know what happened there, and that was a bummer. I really wanted to see if I made a mistake here. If you've seen the video from the first ride back on the bike, I mentioned there that the BB had a lot of drag to it. When I spun the crank, it didn't spin more than a revolution really. They turned smoothly though, there were no unevenness or weird noises, but the feeling was like they had been stuffed with too much grease. I didn't really inspect the BB bearings before pressing them in. That was probably my first mistake. My thinking is that I pressed the cups too tight and put too much pressure on the bearings. I couldn't feel the drag while riding or anything, so it wasn't anything crazy. And after the first ride I took the chain off and spun the cranks, and the drag had decreased a lot. Not quite to the level of my previous ceramic bearings, but nothing that would bother my OCD anymore. So I think I managed to avoid any immediate damage. In worst case, these BB might wear a bit faster than normal, but it's not the end of the world. It's definitely a reminder of how careful you need to be when pressing in bearings and bearing cups. I've been lucky not to have had any problems like these up until now, but you live and you learn, like they said. I'm an amateur mechanic after all. I definitely think I will look into those thread together bottom bracket solutions for the next installation though. Anyway, back to the build. After the cups were in the frame, I carefully cleaned off any brake protector around the bottom bracket shell, as this is super sticky. The last thing you want is to get this stuff on your bearings, so careful with that. Then it was time to get those beautiful cranks in place. I put a layer of grease on both the bearings and the crank spindle. I put on the bearing dust cover on the spindle for the non-drive side. I probably should have put on the dust cover before the grease in hindsight, but there you go. Then I use a rubber mallet to gently tap the crank into the frame. After that, I put some more grease on the splines on the drive side and put on the bearing dust cover, then the drive side crank arm with the chainring in place. If you're interested in knowing how to install chainrings on these Easton EC90SL cranks, check my previous video where I did a full unboxing and a proper installation of the chainring. Then I tightened down the crank with an 8mm hex key and finished off by torquing down the crank with my big torque wrench down to 50 Nm. To preload the bottom bracket bearings, I made sure the drive side was pushed as far in as possible towards the frame. Then I turned the preload collar or lock ring on the non-drive side just hand tight against the BB and made sure it didn't have any play in the crank. I used a 2mm Allen key to lock the ring in place, just enough to close the gap in the ring. If you over tighten it, it could damage the lock ring, they say, so be careful there. To cut the new chain to length, I simply used my old chain as a reference. I hung both chains from a small hex key and I could easily see where I needed to cut the chain. The new chain came with a quick link though, so I needed to take that into account as well. As you can see, when running a 1x with a 42 chainring and a chain that should be long enough for a 46 tooth cog in the back, I only needed to remove one chain link set or one inner and outer link from this 116 link chain. Of course, this could differ a lot depending on how long chain stays you have, so there's no one length to fit all chainring cassette combinations, unfortunately. So when the chain was cut, I threaded the chain around the chainring and through the rear mech and connected the ends with the quick link. To lock the quick link in place without the quick link tool or needle nose pliers, I put the rear wheel on, made sure I had the link between the cassette and the chainring above the chainstay, and then I just gently pushed the crank arm with my foot until I could hear that lock ring pop into its locked position. And that's it. To finish this part off, I will just put on the beautiful Berg Lupina saddle. This is mostly just mentally to make this look like a bike. I will finalize the actual saddle position a bit later on in the build. Next, I will remove the fork and install the proper headset and make sure everything is nice and greased up. At the start of the build, I put the headset from my crashed bike on temporarily just while working on the bike. In hindsight, I could have done this right from the beginning, as I didn't really have to remove the fork as I thought I would have to when routing the brake hoses and Di2. As the hoses are internally routed through the handlebars, it became quite tight and cumbersome to do this, and as you can see, I ended up doing this down on the floor with all my limbs put to work. Home mechanic shenanigans at its best. So with the fork out of the frame, I removed the old headset bearings and made sure I had all the parts for the new one ready to go. So I put some fresh grease on the lower bearing seat first, a nice thick layer. I always like to go a bit overboard with the grease here. Then I greased up the bearing itself and pushed it into the frame. I could just have put the bearing on the crown race instead and not needing to worry about it falling out. In this case though, the grease seemed to keep that bearing in place, no problem. Only thing I would point out here is that the bearing has an angled side and you need to match that with the angled side of the bearing seat. Then I put a layer of grease on the top bearing seat and on the crown race of the fork. The open fork has a molded carbon race, so no need to mess around with separate races that you need to press on, and this style of molded in crown races also saves a pretty hefty chunk of weight, and that's always a bonus in my eyes. Then I threaded the fork back into the frame. Put some grease on the top bearing as well, and just like the bottom bearing, this bearing has an angled side that I need to match up with the angle of the bearing seat. Then I just put on the bearing wedge, and after that the headset top cover. Then I just took some degreaser in a paper towel and wiped off the stereo tube, as I don't want any grease, making it even easier for the stem to slip around. I also made sure to wipe off any excess around the bearing top cap and the fork crown. Then I put the stem and handlebar back on the bike and tighten this down just so everything stays in place. I will do the final adjustment and preloading of the headset when I'll dial in my position a bit later on. To do that final position adjustment, I needed to get the brakes dialed in so I could ride a bike. So I put the brake rotor on my road wheels that I had taken apart after the crash to inspect, and everything seemed normal there. I removed the bleed block from the front caliper and then installed the brake pads. Then I put the wheel back into the fork. As these brake pads are not brand new, I needed to pump the lever a few times to get the pistons out enough to make the pad bite to the rotor. I tightened down the brake calipers, and as you can hear, they needed some adjustment. So I used the classic method here. I loosened the bolts, squeezed the brake lever and tightened the bolts down again, and I was lucky enough to get this working without any rubbing on my second try. Then I just put in my gravel wheels as well, just to confirm that I didn't need to readjust anything again. Both these wheels have the DT Swiss 240S hubs. The disc alignment seemed to be pretty spot on between the two wheel sets. So that's something to think about if you're going with two different wheel sets. Having the same hub will make your life a bit easier, I think. Then I needed to do the same thing at the rear, remove the bleed block and install the brake pads. As I was doing this, I started to think about what wheels I would actually use during this winter. I decided to use my gravel wheels, and as I had my 46 cassette mounted on that one, I decided to swap that out for my 42 cassette instead, as I don't really need that 46 for the kind of riding I will do this winter. The 46 is more of a bike packing setup in my case, and a 42-42 combination will take me up pretty much all the climbs I can find around my area. And last but not least, that 42 cassette, it's a lot lighter than the 46 one, so stay tuned for the final weight. Back to the brake adjustments. I put the wheel back into the bike and did basically the same thing to my rear caliper as I did to the front. Loosened the bolts, squeeze the brake lever and tighten the bolts again, and that's all it took this time, luckily. Now we're getting closer to having this bike rideable. Next step for me was installing the pedals. I just put some grease on the threads and used that pedal washer that came with the crank. Remembering to check the left and right marking on the pedal, as the drive side pedal has normal threads and the non-drive side pedal has reverse threads. As this is Shimano, I tightened this down with a 8mm hex key. I honestly prefer pedal wrenches as they're a bit easier to reach around with. Unfortunately, on these XT SPD pedals there are no slots for pedal wrenches, so the hex key has to do. As I'm running 1x, I don't need to mount the front mech. Luckily on this open frame, you can remove the front derailleur tab with a hex key and save a few grams on that tab. And just to take it a bit further, I replaced the screws with some nylon screws I found on Amazon. Just because the weight weenie in me is still very much alive, even though you could argue that it doesn't make that much sense on a gravel bike, but still. Every gram you can save is still a gram, and yeah, I can't really justify it with logic. It's always something I will do if I can. I'm just sick. I'm sick in the head. I know I need help, but shogunai, as we say here in Japan. Then I will just mount my Arundel mandible cages. I love these things. These have been with me for a couple of years and a couple of bikes now, and I have never lost a bottle. They're almost a bit too tight. Next, I decided to put on a chainstay protector. I actually forgot to put this on my first bike. Went out for a test ride, hit a pothole and nicked my chainstay. So I definitely did not want that to happen again. So I just made sure the chainstay was clean and dry. This is a pretty cheap semi-thick chain protector, and I found this to have worked pretty good on both my Open and my old Mason bokeh, so I decided to use the same one again. If I know I'm going on really rough terrain, I might actually put on a removable one just for that extra peace of mind, but I like it to be simple and preferably not be visible at all, so the clear one will be the base protection at least. So next I wanted to secure the handlebar end junction. I put the holder on and used some double-sided tape to keep that junction in place. That double-sided tape will come in handy when I start wrapping the handlebar tape, once I've decided exactly where I want my shift levers. Speaking of that, I then prepared the bars for that first little trial run, making sure I had the right angle on the tops and that the bars were straight. And once I did that, I realized my hoods were angled very low, so I needed to adjust that. I also made sure the horizontal angle of the hoods was about where I wanted them. This is highly personal, of course. It's nice to get in the ballpark before wrapping the handlebar tape. But even if you wrap the handlebars, you can usually still adjust this a bit after the fact. After I was happy with the positions of the levers and the handlebars, I made sure everything was tightened down to spec and then moved on to the saddle and seat post. In terms of saddle position, I'm not very sensitive to small changes. I can see my marks on the rails from my old bike. I just put the saddle fore aft in the same position and try to start with the saddle level horizontally, and I will probably make some adjustments here once I get on the bike. My old NV seat post here has been with me now for 5 years or something like that, and it's definitely starting to show a lot of wear. I can tell that by the fact that if I don't use a lot of carbon paste, it will slip with the spec 5 Nm clamping force. So I'm being very generous with the carbon paste and then measure my saddle height, which is around 77 centimeters. Like I said, I'm not super picky when it comes to this. I usually play around with the height as well during the season. I try to wipe off any excess carbon paste, and then I just tighten down the seat clamp to 5 Nm. Then I took the bike out, had a quick ride on it just to make sure the levers, the stem, the handlebars and everything was in the right place. Back in the bike room, I used a hairdryer to shrink the shrink tubing around the brake hose and the Di2 cable. I wanted to do this before I started to wrap the handlebar tape, just to make sure I don't melt anything around the tape. As for the actual handlebar tape, in this case I use Pro's Sports Control handlebar tape. It's the 2.5 millimeter thick one, I think. I like to ride without gloves when I can, and this is just thick enough for me, and it's very cheap, so it's not the end of the world to replace this. I used to be a big fan of the Blizzard Skin bar tape, but the prices are pretty ridiculous for what it is, so I ended up using this Pro bar tape for the last 3 wraps, I think. So to wrap the handlebar tape, when you are using the Di2 handlebar end junction, you basically start off by cutting the tape diagonally, just like as you would at the top of the bars when you're finishing off the wrap. Then I will use that double-sided tape I used when securing the Di2 junction, remove that cover tape and start wrapping the bars. I know there's probably a lot of opinions on which way you wrap your handlebar tape. I think it depends on if you're a pusher or a puller. In my case, I found this has been working very good for me the last couple of wraps I've done, so I continue doing this stuff. I also like to wrap my levers with the figure 8 to have a bit more girth around the lever. I have something to grab onto. This usually means though that my bar tapes comes up a bit short. In a perfect world, I would like to have about 1 more centimeter of wrap here, I think, but I'm not too picky. My finishing tape is actually a half with electrical tape. I never use the finishing tape that comes with the bar tape. I never think it looks very good, to be honest. That is just my personal opinion. Instead, I use this half with electrical tape that leaves a nice and neat finishing job. If I were to give any kind of tip while wrapping the bars, is never to stretch the electrical tape once you finish the wrap off. If you stretch it, it would just end up being a lot of adhesive stuff coming out and making everything all sticky. The other side of the bar, I wrapped the traditional way with a bar end plug. I could use the dummy plug that comes with the Di2 junction, but yeah, I couldn't be bothered. And as you see here, I'm not afraid to unwrap and rewrap if I have to. I rather do this a couple of times and get it nice and neat than have some uneven wrapping going on. So that's it for the wrap. As the finishing touch here, I will use some clear tape or protective tape. I think you can find it under helicopter tape or something like that in the States. I will use that tape to just cover that area where my front brake hose kind of rubs a bit when turning the bars on the head tube, just to keep that from wearing down the paint. I will also put the same kind of tape when I put on bike packing bags and stuff like that. So it's a nice tip if you want to protect your paint finish as much as possible. I also realized I forgot to insert a safety clip in my brake caliper. So that will be the final step of this build. And all that's left now is to go out and ride it. So I think this is it for this build. Always fun to build a new bike, since this is crash replacement frame. There wasn't any real surprises here. It needs to be said though, kudos to Open for that crash replacement policy. I crashed my frame and I got 50% off of a new frame. If you compare that to Canyon's policy, they offered me 20% off a new frame, which wasn't even crashed. It just cracked, but that's another story. Kudos to Open, for sure. I already talked about the new parts in my first ride video, but compared to my first build, new handlebars, a new crank, and both have been excellent. I especially like the new handlebars. Like I said in the build there, I wish I had a little bit longer bar tape. Would be nice to have like a 1 centimeter more here. Not the end of the world though. I'll survive. The hardest part was for sure routing the brake hoses through the handlebar. That was pretty annoying. One tip that I got in the comments there was to use some kind of lubricant or even like soap just to put a bit on the hoses when pushing them through the handlebars. And that sounds like a really good idea, so definitely try that. Also a few comments that I should have used a rope or a string and used a vacuum cleaner to route everything through the bars. I did that in my first build of this Open, not this Open, but the crashed Open. Also had a video of that, so if you want to see how you use a vacuum to route Di2 through the handlebars, check that video, as this was already prepared for internal routing with those plastic hoses and everything. I didn't think I needed those, but in hindsight it might have been a good idea. But it all went good in the end. One thing I wish I had done a bit more neater was the string tubing. As you can see here, I should have made sure the Di2 cable didn't wrap around the hose like it does here, but yeah, might fix that in the future. For now though, this will have to do. There were a few comments and a lot of good tips on the other parts of the build video, so if you're building up your own bike, the comments section is definitely a nice gold mine to dig through. In terms of future plans, I always look for places to shave a few grams because I'm sick in the head. So stay tuned for that. I might have something coming up soon. As always, if you have any comments or questions about the build, feel free to leave them down in the comments. And I almost forgot, if you found this video or build series interesting and helpful, feel free to leave a like, always appreciated, and subscribe for more content coming up soonish. And I will catch you in the next one. Peace.